You're listening to The Back 40, the podcast for Ontario farmers, covering topics and issues that matter most to Ontario agriculture. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm the host of The Back 40, Mike Brine, agribusiness specialist at Trillium Mutual Insurance. Farmers are starting to get a lot more access to data on their farm, whether it be from their crops and from their satellite photos of their crops, or monitoring their barns, or monitoring their farm equipment. In fact, we're getting to the point where there's a lot of data coming in, and sometimes that can be pretty overwhelming. So what do you do with all that data? How do you manage it? Well, some farmers have turned to outside companies to help them manage their data and figure out what to do with it. One such company that's assisting farmers with managing that data is Intelliculture. And today we're talking with their CEO, Cole Powers. Cole, welcome to the Back 40.
Thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
So tell us, what exactly is Intelliculture?
Yeah, Intelliculture at its core is a company built to support the farming community and growers. The core of what we do is help our farms manage their data and ideally graft out some automation to their management practices there. So really helping to take all the data that they have on the farm and turn that into actionable insight for them to better manage the farm.
So how long have you been at this?
Yeah, we've been at it a number of years now. Started out with a number of local farms in Ontario quite a few years back, doing some trials and demos, and now we're on farms across North America.
Give us a little bit of the history on this. How did it come about? How did you get involved in this? And why did you start managing data for people?
For sure. So I'll take you back in time to myself and the co-founding team a number of years ago. I grew up in Ontario anyhow, and went off to University of Waterloo and was through and through an automotive nerd. I loved working on cars. I loved everything to do with the automotive industry. And I was really fortunate to meet my two co-founders at the University of Waterloo as well, who also loved cars. So we worked together for a number of years on a design team while we were in college, essentially building a Chevy Camaro, and got a lot of great experience in the automotive industry. And bear with me here, I'm talking all about cars, but this is a farming podcast, but we'll get there. Spent a ton of time working with these folks, companies like GM and Tesla, and we were through and through doing data and telematics solutions for these companies. Myself, though, growing up in Ontario, was always surrounded by farming. And so loved the industry more than anything else. And at the end of the day, when my co-founders and I got spending more and more time together, we couldn't come to an industry that we cared more about than agriculture. It's the backbone of our nation. And so really Intelliculture was the fusion of that. We had all that automotive experience that we started with, and we really wanted to graft that into an industry that we cared so much about. That was kind of the inception of Intelliculture. We've meandered a lot over the years in terms of what we actually do, but we took that lens of machinery and automotive and went and started talking with producers and growers to understand how and where we might be able to assist the industry.
So exactly how do you manage data for people?
What we have is this little plug and play device. And I realize that this is a podcast, so you can't see that I'm holding it up probably. But essentially, it's a GPS device that gets installed into everything on the farm on wheels. So whether that's tractors, trucks, combines, etc. From there, what we're doing is that's communicated over cellular. And then we're breaking that down into reports and recommendations for these growers, looking at a few different domains on their farm. First and foremost, we look at the actual operations and task data, and essentially to give billing clarity in terms of how they're running their farm. From maybe you're spending a lot of time combining or out disking, for example, and we'll break that down and give recommendations on any misnomers that might happen in the field. Beyond that, we also look at the health of the machinery itself as an asset to the business. So in the same way that you're taking your truck in for an oil change every 10,000 kilometers, we help our growers keep track of that on their machines as well and pull out any trouble codes like a check engine light and relay that information back to our farms.
So little things like, you say, the oil change or the check engine light, all of that information pulled into one spot. So if you have multiple people running multiple pieces of equipment, you have access to that data without hoping that somebody's going to report back to you that, hey, the tractor's 25 hours over an oil change, it should be done.
Yeah, exactly. And then we get into some of the safety components as well, right? Especially with rollover events. We have a number of growers that are running ATVs for scouting, for example. And so you might have, on a muddy day, that ATV could potentially roll over or get stuck out in the field. So we're actually able to, in real time, alert folks within the organization that there might have been a safety or a concern on the farm so they can go and address that in real time.
Tractors, combines, anything with wheels and a motor, what all does it collect from?
Literally anything on wheels on a motor that farms are interested in learning more about. Typically, we're installing in a lot of tractors, but we do see a lot of ATVs or side-by-sides for carting employees around, as well as even service trucks. So if you have like employee or staff vehicles, typically folks are installing those as well to bring that data all into one spot for you.
What size of an operation would you say you'd have to have in order to need a program or need someone to manage the data for you?
I think typically we're seeing that we're working with farms or growers that have usually 10 or more machines in their operation. Usually the folks that have a really good pulse on their farm, but when you're bringing in a lot more labor and staff, and especially with the turnover rates as of late in the industry, it's once you start to bring in more labor and more machines than about 10 on the farm is where we start to see most of the uptake of our system.
So something like an orchard, for example, where you have a lot of smaller tractors moving out in the fields, that'd be a place that this would work quite well.
Yeah, exactly. We do a lot of work in the specialty crop space, so orchards, vineyards, etc.
But adaptable to anywhere.
Absolutely. And that's the goal. As we get more sophisticated and continue growing the operation, the organization out, we want to be able to support growers across the board.
You're talking about maintenance data off of the tractors. A lot of the new tractors are collecting a lot of data there. Are you able to tap into that, or is that proprietary that you're not able to get any sort of feel for what they're collecting there?
So it's a really good question. And the answer is it kind of depends, in all honesty, Mike. The core of it is if these machines, and especially the newer ones, are broadcasting what's called public CAN data, meaning that they're following a very standardized protocol. In that respect, we're able to pull that data right off of the machines and relay that to our growers. In terms of the proprietary algorithms and information that those machines do have, we don't do any like reverse engineering or digging into that. In the future, we do definitely want to integrate and work closer with the OEMs so that we can continue bringing value to our growers. But typically right now, we're staying in the public domain of data.
So, other than things like check engine lights and that, and obviously speed and position, what else can you collect off the public domain information?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, especially in the newer machines. The data is getting more and more verbose. We're able to get all sorts of information around like engine operation parameters, for example, even. So we can pull in your engine RPM. A lot of the times we're getting PTO signals coming in off of that CAN bus, over temperature alerts that we can relay to our growers, etc.
So, a fair amount of information that be quite useful when you're looking at a tractor that maybe has had problems or potentially could have problems, something like the temperatures, like it's been running hot for the last half day. Is there an alarm there that would sound to somebody that they could collect that data? Obviously, the operator should see that, but sometimes they tend to ignore those little details.
The season gets so busy, right? What we're able to do is we essentially build out custom reports for all of our growers. So typically we're working with folks to understand what their normal operation looks like in the areas where they might have the most concern. And then what we do is we'll build out email and text alerting depending on the grower's preference, and then configure that such that they can get the information in the ways that they're most comfortable with.
And to the right person. If you've got a
And
farm
to the right person.
manager that's looking after that, or a maintenance person, they need to have that data and that could go to them.
Exactly.
What sort of payback do you find that growers get on this? Do they find that it pays back fairly quickly? And what do they value the most out of this information that they're picking up?
That's a great question. We've actually done a white paper at Intelliculture and basically done a few case studies and aggregated that information across our growers. What we've been seeing is about a 4x return on investment from an actual like infield perspective. And so that's looking at value saved on the farm compared to cost of the subscription to the Intelliculture management software. In terms of the biggest value and payback that our growers are seeing, if we take the lens of looking at more of the specialty crops in the orchards especially, what we're seeing there is really on the as applied coverage mapping that we provide. So when these folks are out applying pesticide or herbicide to their crops, for example, especially if you have seasonal staff that you're bringing in, so it's quite a big operation to organize. What can happen is you might miss a block in your vineyard or in your orchard, for example. What that can lead to is a pest and mildew outbreak, which can cost a substantial amount of money in terms of your yields from that crop. So by having us installed in the system, we're actually able to alert our growers of those misspray events in the farm. That's far and wide the biggest ROI on the system is if we can prevent those mistakes from happening. Beyond that, the other facets that build into it are really looking at the actual cost of machinery itself. So looking at preventative maintenance rather than reactive. And that kind of laces down into another two areas you can really look at from a value standpoint. On one hand, it's the actual cost of the machine itself from a depreciation standpoint. So by doing preventative maintenance rather than reactive, you're actually preserving the longevity of your machines. But beyond that as well, it's a risk prevention mechanism. As you look at keeping up with your services on those machines, essentially what you're doing is you're deferring or preventing downtime. And especially in Ontario, when you have such a short window a lot of the time for critical seasons like harvest, if that machine goes down in harvest season, that's a huge cost to the operation. And I went on a bit of a ramble there, but there's a few different domains of value. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I'm also thinking from the standpoint of, you talk about the spray events, and it's not just that you've sprayed it, but it also would track when you've sprayed it. And I know that one of the issues that's been in this area certainly has been damage from spray drift. And if you had one of these in here and you can say, I've got it tracked, this is when I sprayed the field, and then you record the other data with it, like wind speed, wind direction, and that sort of thing, that could be a real advantage to record keeping as to if there was a problem with spray drift.
It's funny you mentioned that spray drift component. I was literally chatting with another crop consultant and an agronomist the other day about how imperative that can be from a spray reporting standpoint, and just making sure that you got that historical log, right? So there's no ifs, ands, or buts for questions anymore about what's been done in your operation. It really brings a lot of clarity to what's been happening for you.
Now, there's only so much data that you can collect. You've collected from the vehicle itself, you've shown where it is in the field, but there's got to be a bit of buy-in from the producers here and the data that they have to enter in. Any problems with getting them to enter what they're doing? Like, it's great to have the tractor out there, but is it disking? Is it spraying? What's it doing? Is there any problem with that?
That's one of our guiding principles really is to keep simplicity sort of front of mind in how we're developing things. And so with that, our approach is complete passive integration is the ideal way to go. So right now there is some challenges with it. It's a one button click essentially with Intelliculture to log that task data. And that's really where we're looking sort of the next phase of the company as well, as to abstract that out altogether. Essentially, because we've got historical information now, we can actually automatically figure out, or we will be able to automatically detect and figure out the task that's happening on the farm. And then the producer no longer needs to put in really anything to the system. And hopefully it's just sitting on value.
That would be quite useful, because I know that a lot of times that little bit of record keeping can be really difficult to do. It should be simple, but you get in a rush and you forget when you walk into the field or drive into the field that you need to log what it is that you're actually going to be doing.
Exactly. And that's just it, right? That's one of the biggest areas that we're trying to really dial in on. And obviously there's so much room for improvement, but it's any of these data systems is really is garbage in, garbage out. Folks are so busy out in the field that it's a stretch to expect them to put in anything, really. At the end of the day, we should be giving them time back in their day in actionable decisions, not requiring anything of them to bring more value to their farm.
Yes, but at some point you've got to do your record keeping. Like
That's
if, if the system wasn't there to record this, you should be writing down in a book what you're doing. You should be logging all of that information. What does that tractor have been doing? Who's been running it? Anything noted?
Right.
Like, you should be keeping a logbook anyway. Is there a spot in the vehicle itself, the tractor or ATV, to log what you're doing, or is that something that has to be done outside of that?
No, so that can happen right in the cab with our system right now. So we have what we call our cab application. It's essentially a very lightweight like spray or task mapping tool. And you can go in and collect the tasks or other information that you're doing in the cab that day. And then what we're able to do is actually just fill that back into the actual fields and machines that are logged in the system.
Do you like what you're hearing from the Back 40? We'd like to hear from you. Send us an email with your comments and thoughts to theback40@trilliummutual.com, or follow us on social media @Trillium Mutual. So it's great when you're dealing with relatively new equipment. Within the last 5 years or so, they've got a lot of monitoring equipment there, and even stuff for the last 20 years. I mean, there's a lot of electronics on that. But on most farms, there's always that one piece of equipment that is older. Like, I'll use an example. I blow snow with a 1959 David Brown 950. And it's a challenge just to keep the lights working on that thing. There's no electronics whatsoever. Is that something that you could monitor? Do you have any way of checking what something like that would be doing?
We can. If the lights are having a hard time staying on, we also might have a hard time staying on, admittedly. But the absolute root of what we need. So if we can get it like a fuse connection into a battery or anything like that, we're typically able to bring a little bit of digitization and a little bit of data collection to those assets. We do have other solar devices that we're capable of working with as well if we get into like implements, etc. But we can't get as granular in terms of the actual task and whatnot that's going on in that approach.
So you'd be able to collect things like position and speed and where it is in the fields and that sort of data. But without some fairly sophisticated monitoring systems, you wouldn't be able to check things like temperature and oil pressure, and that would be outside of the
Yeah,
ability to grab at this point.
exactly. The point of kind of cut off there is, yeah, position data, speed data, and we can also still track from a service scheduling perspective because we can calculate engine hours once we are installed. Essentially, the signals that are coming from the computers of those machines were, I mean, if the computers aren't there, we're not able to read them.
My dad bought and restored the tractor. I don't believe he ever intended that it be put to work, but like I said, I blow snow with it. It's one of the newer ones, so I'm thinking if you can't do it with it, nothing older than that's going to be any better. But it is good to know because, in all seriousness, it's a rare farm that doesn't have one piece of equipment out there that would fit into that category. You go back into stuff that's 40, 50 years old, and we say, well, nobody uses that, but you've got that one task that's good for,
Yeah.
and you would use that. A friend of mine used to keep an old John Deere tractor for cutting hay because the wheels cut off really short and he could get around the corners a lot better with that particular tractor. And I'm not sure he used it for anything else.
Exactly. And that's just it, right? There's such a high utility factor to some of those older machines, right? And that's why we've tried to kind of keep that in our mind a little bit. And that data in general, if you have pockets or holes in that data set, it'll lead to misinformed decisions or reporting if you don't have it like that full holistic picture, right? And so I completely agree. There's nothing quite like an old tractor that gets the job done the way that you've been wanting it to work for you, right?
Yeah, but you're going to have to just put up with the fact that you're not going to get that data from it. This is a fairly comprehensive system, and you're talking about even more comprehensive. There's got to have been some challenges along the way.
Absolutely. Every day has its challenges. The starting point of Intelliculture, really, and probably the biggest challenge that we face has just been working to understand how we can best manage this data for our producers and our growers. We came in really excited about data in the machinery space in general, but it took at least a year, if not more, of really working closely with some producers in our backyards, understanding to them what the most pain points and needs were from a data management standpoint, and making sure that we didn't get ourselves distracted. That's probably been one of the bigger challenges early on, and it's one that we constantly battle as we're building things out here. The other one is every machine and every operation is a little bit different, right? Agriculture in general, every farm has its nuances and its ways that work best for that farm. And the approach that's so important is, I guess, one of humility. We try to help provide and organize this data for our growers and give them recommendations. At the end of the day, they know their farm way better than we ever will. I think keeping that front of mind has been important in terms of how we're developing the solution, because as soon as you lose sight of that, it can be down a rabbit hole of all sorts of troubles.
What's the most unusual request that you get for collecting data for someone to try and find out more about their operation?
Oh gosh, that's a tough question. There's all sorts of weird ones. I think I briefly alluded to like the ATV speeding one. That's one that's come up a couple of times, but in particular, there's a couple of our farms that have a very hilly terrain. And they asked us to set up a custom alert where it was looking at a particular hill on their operation from an ATV standpoint, because they kept having ATVs roll over there and they wanted an alert of if an ATV was going close to that hill. So that was like a really bizarre one for us. Otherwise, some of the other interesting ones that we've had, getting into some of that engine RPM and overheating, alerting on specific operation parameters of a particular machine that was a lemon on this farm, so that they could basically have a report and go to their dealer and kind of work through some of the challenges that they've been having. Maybe they're not weird, but they're very like specific requests that it was very interesting for us to try and work through that with the grower.
That's those unique pain points that you were talking about, that you listen to the individual operator,
Exactly.
individual grower as to what it is that's causing them the most trouble.
Yeah, exactly, and it becomes a challenge, right? Because as we're growing our business as well, we want to make sure that we're always listening to our producers and our growers. But then on the same token, there's a million and one solutions and problems that are there on the farm, so you need to pick your battles a little bit too.
Yeah, it's something that, as you say, it can be done, but how much effort is it going to take in order to be able to do that?
Yeah.
Some of the stuff there you talked about, hopefully making it so that you could tell what the task was without actually having to input it. What do you see coming for Intelliculture in the next couple of years?
That automated task recognition is one that we're quite excited about, and it's kind of front of mind. I won't bore you with all of the technical details of how we're thinking about that yet, but it's certainly one that we're looking towards. Beyond that, we've had a lot of requests from folks as well, bring in manual labor tracking. For example, if you're doing a manual pick out on an apple orchard, it's kind of one of the blind spots of our software right now. So that I expect coming down the pipeline in sort of the more tangible and near future. Beyond that, I think that really our goal or our vision at Intelliculture is to try and be able to alert these growers of items that they might not even be expecting to happen. Because that's really where the big value is when it comes to like managing and risk management on the farm, is if we can start to predict breakdowns altogether before they would even happen, or if we can predict an event or a mistake on the farm in real time is great, but even before it happens would be even better. So that's kind of where we're looking in the future. And that gets a little bit hand wavy and a little bit out there. But that's kind of the vision of what we think might be possible in the future when we have all this data flowing around on the farm and helping to distill it down for the growers.
What sort of data do you see companies providing? As you're in the business of managing the data, essentially, what's coming down the road that they're going to be able to monitor on those different pieces of equipment that you might be able to use in your operation?
That's a big question. I think it's an exciting time in the industry. You're starting to see automation and robotics coming to the farm. You're starting to see remote sensing. And with all of those different technologies come more sources of data. And that's really good and it's really bad, right? Because with more data can come more dilution and more noise. Essentially, one that I think is going to be interesting to look at in the future is if you can start to select out or carve out specific items or specific tasks on the farm that you can offload to some robotics, then it's hopefully going to net some benefit to the industry, especially as labor is becoming more and more challenging and more costly. I've heard horror stories of literally not being able to finish harvest just because they can't bring the labor in to pick their apples or their cherries. That I think is a really exciting data source for us to help manage and then give more recommendation and feedback on that to the growers.
Yeah, that's something that's going to be critical. We all talk about autonomous units that are working out in the field and they're going to be cutting grass and they're going to maybe doing some spraying and a few other things that they're going to be able to do. But if one person's going to operate all of those items, there's got to be a way to manage them. And not every company is going to provide units that are going to be able to do the same thing.
I don't think that there's going to be like one industry consolidated effort of that automation. So that's, I think, one of our big motivators. And I think a lot of the ag tech companies out there is to be able to help bridge that gap of the producer who's running their farm today and how they're managing their farm today is going to be vastly different to how you have to manage that robot or that automation. And so if we can provide a transitional layer in there, or at least make that bridge a little bit easier for the producers, then I would say that's a job well done.
We think now, gathering data and pulling it all into one spot where, the one tractor's red, one tractor's green, and one tractor's blue. They all have different interfaces that you're supposed to work from. This is a system that pulls all that information in. That's only going to become more critical going forward.
Couldn't agree more.
So you operate in Ontario, but you're in other markets as well. Where else are you selling these units?
Yeah, we've had a lot of uptake down in California. That's actually where I'm dialing in from today. The whole West Coast is really, especially with our focus on the specialty crop space right now, we're seeing a lot of value there. So looking a lot at California, Washington, BC, Oregon, etc. Beyond that, Ontario is its home. So we love supporting Ontario producers. And then also looking hopefully in the future to get into some of the other pockets down in like New York for their apples and other specialty crops.
Now we see this in specialty crops and orchards and that sort of thing, and market gardening, I'm sure, with large operations. How long before we're going to see this into some of our field crop operations? Because that's something that typically people have fewer units, they run larger units, but fewer of them. Are we waiting for the farms to get bigger, or is the technology going to match up to smaller operations as well?
We do have a few folks in the more traditional like cash and row crop space that we're working with. But like you said, typically those folks are running a little bit less machines and a little bit less staff. So there's less vulnerability there. That said, we're hopeful that we can continue growing out the technology in ways that will make it justifiable and really bring out value for those folks as well. And I think one of the lenses or the mechanisms to get there is looking towards that preventative maintenance piece as well. So you look at the cost of a combine, for example, and it's astronomical compared to like a little skinny orchard tractor. As the software and as our company grows more sophisticated and we get into that, what we would call prognostics or looking at essentially predicting breakdowns, I think that's going to help justify cost in the smaller operations and in that row and cash crop space.
How far away do you think we are before we come up with something like that? I'm asking you to gaze into that crystal ball, But I know that as soon as some people hear this, they're like, okay, so when am I going to be able to predict my machinery is going to break down?
I'll speak in terms of high level abstractions, not from an Intelliculture
Yep.
specifically standpoint here, but I think like we're already seeing it in the automotive space, which is exciting. You've already got a high level of sophistication and prediction in that industry. I think it's only a matter of time before it comes over to ag as well. The work that's being done in the automotive space, it's really only like a degree or two of separation into the agriculture industry as well. You look at a tractor or a combine, and there's differences absolutely compared to the automotive space. And so given that lens, if that's a true assumption to the technology, then it's probably only a few years out, I think, before you're going to start to see at least the first inclinations of that coming over to the ag industry, I hope.
Is that something that we're going to see companies like Case IH and John Deere, are they going to be the ones that drive that? Or is that going to be somebody like yourselves that manage that data for somebody so that they can have that predictor?
I think it's going to be a bit of both. And again, this is a bit of a personal stance, really, but I think it's collaboration in the industry is the only way that it's going to come to fruition for the benefit of the producer. So I think it's going to be the work of all folks in the industry to get there.
And maybe the biggest challenge that the large companies will face is they can give you a generic solution where you can customize something, where they can measure this stuff, but it isn't necessarily going to be exactly what the producer needs, where you can give them that exact solution that they're looking for.
That's the hope, yeah.
Even if it is an ATV on the side of a hill that there's an alert for.
Exactly, right. And that's one of the benefits of being a smaller or having a lot of smaller companies in the industries is we can all work pretty closely with the growers, and eventually that's going to aggregate out and hopefully come to a more universal solution. But it's something that's in the pocket now, right? Like if we come across another producer who's got a big hill and they have ATVs that they're worried about, it's a quick switch to turn on for them now.
It's not only that, but we laugh a little bit about the hill and the ATVs, but there's other places that same technology will work. And it isn't necessarily a hill and an ATV, but maybe it's a wet hole in the farm and a tractor. It's something that you can have an alert there. As you say, you've already done that. It's pretty adaptable to a different type of operation.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
If people want to find out more about Intelliculture and the services that you offer, how do they find out?
Yeah, so you can find us online, just www.intelliculture.ca. So that's INTELLICULTURE.ca. Or you can reach out directly to me. I can be reached at cpowers@intelliculture.ca. That's probably the easiest way. You can find us on Twitter, etc. as well. I know a lot of folks like that.
It's been great talking to you. I'm very excited about the data management that's coming down the road here and what we're going to be able to find out from the information that we are able to collect. Cole, thanks very much for taking the time to be with us today on the Back 40.
Thank you so much for having us, Mike.
You've been listening to The Back 40, brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance. Join us next time when our guest will be Jackie Fraser from Freybert's Fresh Foods in Fergus, and we'll be talking about independent grocers in Ontario. That's next time on The Back 40. Be sure to subscribe to The Back 40 wherever you find your favorite podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. The Back 40, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm Mike Brine. Until next time, take care and stay safe.